The Velthari called it the correction. Every species in the known galaxy had a different name for what happened to humanity 1,000 years ago. The Drenkai called it the culling of the loud ones. The Sorathi collective referred to it in their historical archives as the taming of the feral world. The Galactic Conclave and the governing body of 47 sentient species had an official term buried in Directive 7 of the Pacification Protocols. They called it necessary intervention. Humanity called it something else entirely. They called it the day the sky burned. It began, as most catastrophes do, not with a warning, but with a silence. On the morning of what humans had once marked as March 14th, every satellite above Earth went dark simultaneously. Every radio signal died. Every digital transmission flatlined. Billions of humans looked up from their screens, from their breakfast tables, from their children's faces, and felt, in that animal part of the brain that evolution had never quite managed to silence, that something was wrong. They were right. The Velthari fleet entered Earth's atmosphere not from orbit but from within it, a technology so advanced that human radar systems registered nothing until 3,000 warships materialized inside the cloud layer simultaneously, blotting out the sun across every continent at once. The shadow that fell over Earth that morning was not the shadow of a single ship. It was the shadow of an empire. 17 minutes. That was how long humanity's combined military response lasted. 17 minutes of missiles that vaporized before they reached their targets. 17 minutes of fighter jets that fell from the sky like burning leaves. 17 minutes of every nuclear launch code failing simultaneously, every submarine running dark, every defense grid dissolving as though it had been made of paper. And then, silence. Not the silence of defeat, the silence of demonstration. The Velthari had not come to destroy humanity. Destruction was easy. Destruction was wasteful. The Velthari Empire, spanning 40 star systems and commanding 8 subjugated species, had learned long ago that the most profitable thing you could do with a violent, resourceful, dangerously creative species was not to kill them. It was to own them. The Velthari Supreme Commander, a creature named Vreth Solan, whose forearms moved like the legs of a patient spider, broadcast his first message to Earth in 17 languages simultaneously. His translators had been studying human communications for 60 years. He spoke with the calm, measured tone of someone reading a grocery list. People of Earth, your resistance has been noted. It has also been concluded. You are now subjects of the Velthari Dominion. Compliance will be rewarded with survival. Non-compliance will be answered with the complete sterilization of your planetary biosphere. You have 24 of your hours to choose. They chose survival. Of course they chose survival. Humans always chose survival. The Velthari counted on it. What they did not fully account for, what their 60 years of surveillance, their behavioral models, their probability matrices, and their 11 xenopsychology departments had somehow missed, was what survival looks like when humanity is the one doing it. The chains went on. The work began. The galaxy looked away, satisfied. And somewhere in the dark, behind the eyes of every enslaved human on Earth and in the labor camps of 40 star systems, something woke up. Something that had no name yet. Something that was patient. The first century was the worst. Not because of the violence, though there was violence enough to fill libraries. Not because of the starvation, the displacement, the forced relocation of entire populations to mining worlds at the edge of the Velthari Dominion's territory. The first century was the worst because of the hope. Hope is the cruelest thing you can carry into captivity. It tells you that tomorrow will be different. And when tomorrow comes and is exactly the same as today, hope doesn't quietly die. It screams on the way out. By the end of the first century, most of humanity had stopped hoping. This the Velthari mistook for submission. A Velthari overseer named Keth Varun, stationed at Labor Complex 17 on the mineral moon of Dragath IV, wrote in his personal log during year 93 of the occupation, "The humans have settled well. Their biological endurance is remarkable. They can work longer hours in higher gravity than any of our other subject species. Their cognitive functions remain elevated even under nutritional restrictions that would incapacitate a Sorathi within days. Most importantly, they have ceased their organized resistance. They comply. They work. They survive. Whatever spirit animated their violence in the early years appears to have been extinguished. Keth Varun was a meticulous record-keeper. He filed his logs every 7 days for 30 years. He never noticed the education. It happened in the dark, in the hours between the end of a shift and the beginning of sleep, in the sub-levels of labor complexes where the environmental sensors were old and the Velthari overseers had learned not to bother. It happened in whispers, then in organized quiet, then in an entire underground institution that had no name and no location, and no records that any scanner could find. The humans were teaching each other, not how to read. Most could already read. They were teaching each other everything: engineering, physics, chemistry, xenobiology, the technical specifications of Velthari weaponry that workers gleaned through years of proximity and sharp eyes, and the pretense of total disinterest. The navigation charts that pilots memorized and passed down like prayers. The power signatures of Velthari shielding systems, reverse-engineered over decades by humans who fixed those systems every time they broke and remembered every component they touched. A woman named Sarah Voss, born in a labor camp on Dragath IV in year 112, is credited in what later historians would call the Book of Patience, with the statement that defined the next 9 centuries of human existence. She said it quietly, to a room of 30 children who were supposed to be sleeping. "We are not going to fight them yet. We don't know enough yet. Learn everything. Forget nothing. Tell your children. We are building something they cannot see." She died at the age of 61, never having seen the sky of Earth. Her granddaughter became the first human to successfully bypass a Velthari weapons lock from the inside. Her great-granddaughter designed the first iteration of what would eventually become humanity's most feared military asset. They called it the Answer. The Velthari, meanwhile, grew comfortable. This is a pattern that repeats throughout galactic history with disturbing regularity: the comfort of the conqueror. The Velthari had subjugated 8 species before humanity. All 8 had followed the same arc: initial resistance, gradual compliance, eventual integration into the labor economy, and finally, the slow cultural erosion that made them useful, manageable, and permanently harmless. The Velthari expected humanity to follow the same arc. What the Velthari did not understand, what the entire galactic community did not understand, was that all 8 of those species had something in common that humanity lacked. They had all been conquered after achieving peace. The Sarathi had spent 500 years in harmonious collective governance before the Velthari arrived. The Drenkai had abolished warfare among themselves 2 centuries before first contact. Every species the Velthari had ever successfully subjugated had, at the moment of conquest, already forgotten how to survive under existential pressure. Humanity had not. Humanity had never stopped. Humanity had crawled out of ice ages and survived plagues and rebuilt after world wars and clawed its way back from every extinction-level pressure the universe had thrown at it for 300,000 years. Humanity did not have a cultural memory of peace the way other species did. Humanity had a cultural memory of endurance, of adaptation, of looking at the thing that was trying to kill you, studying it with furious, burning, total attention, and then building something that killed it back. The Velthari had not conquered a civilization. They had poked a species that had been practicing for this exact scenario its entire existence. By year 300, the underground network had a name, not a word, a signal. 3 short taps in a specific rhythm that could be passed through any surface, through any wall, through any crowd. It meant, I know. I remember. I'm ready. By year 500 they had ships, not Velthari ships, not stolen ships, not repaired ships, not retrofitted cargo haulers. Ships that had been built, component by component over decades in sublevels and abandoned maintenance tunnels and the hollow spaces beneath labor complex floors. Ships built from materials that the Velthari had catalogued as industrial waste. Ships whose power signatures had been specifically designed to read as background radiation on Velthari scanners. Ships that were, by any engineering standard the galaxy had ever established, impossible. The Velthari never found them. Not once. In 500 years of occupation with surveillance technology sophisticated enough to detect a single unauthorized thought wave, they never found a single ship. Because the humans had learned something the Velthari never considered teaching them: how to be invisible. By year 800 they had a fleet. By year 992 they had something else. They had a plan. Supreme Commander Vreth Solan IV, great-great-great-great-grandson of the original Vreth Solan, was presiding over the millennial celebration of the Earth correction when it happened. The celebration was being broadcast across 37 star systems. Representatives from every species in the galactic conclave attended in person or via quantum relay. It was meant to be a showcase of Velthari power, a reminder that the galaxy's most dominant empire had, 1,000 years ago, successfully neutralized the only species that had ever been assessed as a long-term galactic threat. The humans performed their ceremonial labor for the assembled dignitaries. They moved in their work formations with the practiced, quiet efficiency that 1,000 years of occupation had produced. The Velthari commentators narrated their movements with the clinical pride of someone displaying livestock. Note the compliance rate, 99.7% across all labor complexes. Note the productivity metrics, which have only increased over the centuries. Note the absence of any organized resistance activity in the past 400 years. The humans are, by every measurable standard, successfully integrated. The Galactic Conclave nodded and recorded their approval. Vreth Solan IV raised his primary arms in the ceremonial gesture of dominion. At that precise moment, every human in every labor complex across 40 star systems stopped working. Not gradually, not in stages, all of them, simultaneously, as though a single switch had been thrown in the consciousness of every human being alive. The Velthari overseers registered the work stoppage and immediately triggered the compliance systems, the neural suppressors embedded in the labor complex infrastructure that had been used to manage human behavior for centuries. The systems activated, delivered their standard deterrent signal. Nothing happened. Because while the Velthari had been celebrating, human engineers had spent the last 6 months systematically replacing the internal components of every neural suppressor in every labor complex with devices that looked identical and scanned identical, but did absolutely nothing except report normal function to the monitoring network. The compliance systems were ghost systems. They had been ghost systems for 6 months. The Velthari had been managing a simulation of compliance while the humans prepared. What happened next took 11 minutes. Not because it was difficult, because the humans had decided that 11 minutes was the appropriate amount of time to take. Long enough to be thorough, short enough to be a message. The labor complex doors opened from the inside. This should have been impossible. The doors were controlled from external stations staffed by Velthari personnel. Except that the humans who maintained those control stations had, over the past decade, made certain modifications to the internal architecture of the door control systems. Modifications invisible to any standard diagnostic. Modifications that, on a specific signal, transferred complete control of every door in every complex to a network that had been built inside the complex walls themselves. The humans walked out, on Dregath IV, on Kalora Station, on the frozen labor continent of Murseft, on 18 mining platforms and 11 agricultural worlds and 432 individual facilities spread across the breadth of the Velthari dominion. The humans walked out into the open and looked up at the sky, and the sky answered. The fleet emerged from what the Velthari called dead space, the regions between star systems where no vessel was expected to travel because the gravitational mathematics made navigation theoretically impossible. It emerged not from one direction, but from every direction simultaneously. 612 warships, built over 5 centuries in the hidden spaces of the Velthari dominion, equipped with weapon systems that the galaxy had never seen, powered by an engine architecture that Velthari physicists would later spend decades trying to understand. The fleet moved like it was angry. Because it was. Every ship had a name. Not a designation number. A name. Named for the humans who had built the knowledge that built the ship. Sarah Voss, Commander Tallis Webb, who had stolen Velthari navigation codes by memorizing them through a ventilation grate. Engineer Davon Holt, who had lost 3 fingers to a Velthari overseer's discipline rod and spent the next 20 years designing the shield-piercing technology those overseers' descendants would die to. Every ship was a monument, every ship was a reckoning. Vreth Salandavou stared at his command display in the 17 seconds he had before the communication channels lit up with emergency signals from across the Dominion. He said one thing. This is not possible. The human fleet's first transmission was not a battle cry. It was not a declaration of war. It was a single audio file, broadcast on every frequency the Velthari used, on every relay they owned, amplified by communication infrastructure that humans had quietly modified over decades to serve this exact purpose. It was a recording. 1,000 years old. The voice of Vreth Solan I, calm and measured, reading his grocery list of Dominion. Compliance will be rewarded with survival. And then, in a voice that was not calm, in a voice that carried 1,000 years of everything they had swallowed and remembered and weaponized. We remember. The Battle of Dragath, as the galaxy named it, because they needed to call it something, lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes. Not because the humans needed 4 hours, because they gave the Velthari fleet 3 hours and 50 minutes to surrender, and used the remaining 27 minutes to eliminate the ones that chose not to. The Velthari Supreme Commander survived. This was not an accident. The humans had been very specific about who survived that day, not out of mercy, out of intent. Vreth Solan I was escorted, in full view of every quantum relay in the galaxy, to a room on the human flagship Sarah Voss. He sat across a table from a human woman named Commander Ilya Marsh. She was 63 years old. She had been born in a labor complex. She had never in her life seen the planet her ancestors had called home. She put a document on the table. She said, "Read it. Sign it. Then you're going to help us deliver it to every member of the Galactic Conclave personally." He read it. Then he understood for the first time and far too late exactly what humanity had spent 1,000 years building. Not just a fleet, not just freedom, a precedent. The document Vreth Solan before signed was not a peace treaty. It was not a ceasefire. It was not a charter of rights or a declaration of independence or any of the forms of paper that species across the galaxy had used to mark the end of conflicts. It was something the Galactic Conclave had never encountered in 40,000 years of recorded interstellar history. It was a bill, itemized, precise, documented with the kind of meticulous, devastating detail that comes from a species that had spent 1,000 years doing nothing but remembering and recording. Line 1. 1,000 years of unrecompensed labor across 40 star systems. The calculation ran to 12 pages. The humans had tracked every hour, every worker, every mineral extracted, every field cultivated, every ship repaired, every structure built across the breadth of the Velthari Dominion for 10 centuries. The number at the bottom of page 12 was so large that the Velthari economic advisors, when they first saw it, assumed there had been a mathematical error. There had not. Line 2. Biological damages. Every human who had died in captivity, every life shortened by labor conditions, every medical need unmet, every child born into chains. The humans had genealogical records. They had tracked family lines across 1,000 years with a precision that stunned galactic archivists. They knew exactly how many of them there had been. They knew exactly how many were gone. The calculation on this line was even longer than the first. Line 3. And this was the line that made the Galactic Conclave chamber go absolutely silent when it was read aloud, was titled simply, Interest. The above amounts, Commander Marsh said, addressing the full assembly of the Galactic Conclave 3 weeks after the Battle of Dragath, represent what the Velthari Dominion owes humanity. The interest calculation represents what the galaxy owes humanity for 1,000 years of silence. 46 pairs of alien eyes, spread across 47 species, stared at her. "You watched," she said. "Every one of you. You had the technology to intervene. Several of you had the military capacity to challenge the Velthari Dominion individually, let alone collectively. You chose not to. You chose to look away. You chose to continue trading with an empire that had enslaved a sapient species. You chose to attend their celebrations. She let that land. We remember that too. The Sarathi ambassador began to speak. Marsh raised one hand. He stopped. "We are not here to negotiate," she said. "We are here because we are giving you the opportunity to make a choice. You had that opportunity 1,000 years ago and you made it. Today you get to make a different one. The bill will be paid. The only question is how." What followed was not a war. Not quite. The galaxy had looked at what humanity had done to the most powerful military force in the known universe in 4 hours and 17 minutes, and the galaxy had made a very quiet, very rapid collective decision that it did not want to find out what humanity could do with motivation, time, and grievance of this scale. The bill was paid. Not all at once. The economic reality of 40 star systems changing hands simultaneously was a logistical challenge even by galactic standards, but it was paid. World by world. Resource by resource. Technology transfer by technology transfer. The Velthari Dominion did not collapse so much as it was methodically dismantled and its components redistributed, with humanity serving as the final authority on what went where and to whom. And Earth, the planet that 1,000 years of slaves had described to their children the way other species described paradise, the blue marble that existed in human cultural memory as something between a home and a religion. Earth was restored. Not the Earth of the day the sky burned. That Earth was gone. The Velthari had modified its atmosphere in the early years of occupation to better suit their administrative personnel. They had restructured its agriculture, altered its ecology, stripped its orbital space of everything built by human hands. The restoration project took 30 years and involved engineering teams from 11 species who were not so much volunteering as they were extremely motivated to appear cooperative. When it was done, when the atmospheric composition matched the records and the oceans were clean and the skies were the specific shade of blue that appeared in 10,000 years of human art, the first generation of humans to set foot on their ancestral world were not the generals or the commanders or the architects of the liberation. They were children. Specifically, 412 children from the labor complex on Dregath IV, chosen by lottery, aged between 6 and 12. They were brought down in a single transport and released into an open field outside what had once been called Stockholm and was now simply called home, and the cameras that broadcast that moment across 37 star systems captured the exact instant when the first child felt actual earth grass under her feet for the first time. She sat down in it immediately. She pressed both palms flat against the ground. She looked like she was listening to something. Later, when asked what she had been doing, she said she was saying hello. Aboard the galactic relay stations, species that had spent 1,000 years not looking at humanity watched that broadcast in complete silence. But the bill was not the end. The bill was the beginning. Commander Marsh, now Premier Marsh of the Terran Recovery Authority, had said 10,000 years. The galaxy had assumed this was rhetoric, dramatic language from a species in the emotional aftermath of liberation. The galaxy was wrong. Humanity had spent 1,000 years building something they called the Long Doctrine. It was simple. It had 3 parts. First, never again. Not for humans. Not for anyone. Every labor complex in the Velthari Dominion had contained humans. Several had contained members of other species, lesser operations, smaller-scale exploitation that the Galactic Conclave had technically prohibited but practically ignored. Humanity catalogued all of it. Humanity tracked every sentient being that had passed through a Velthari facility. Humanity built a new institution, not the Galactic Conclave which had proven what it was, and named it the Watch. The Watch had one purpose: to notice, to record, to ensure that what had happened to humanity could not happen again without the galaxy having to look directly at it. Second, build. The knowledge accumulated over 1,000 years of underground education had produced something extraordinary. Humanity had reverse-engineered Veltari technology, and then surpassed it in several key areas within the first century of working openly. The engine systems that had made the Liberation Fleet's navigation through dead space possible were based on physics that Veltari science had classified as theoretically impossible. Humanity had not read that classification as a limitation. They had read it as a starting point. Within 50 years of liberation, human engineering had become the most sought-after commodity in the galaxy, not because humanity was selling it freely, but because humanity was selectively offering it in exchange for something the galaxy had a difficult time providing: accountability. Every technology transfer came with terms. The terms were always the same: open records, transparent governance, regular watch inspections. The galaxy grumbled. The galaxy complied. Because the alternative, having the humans decide you were not worth trading with, was a category of problem that nobody wanted. Third, remember. This was the quiet one. The one the galaxy understood least, in the early years. Humanity built no monuments to the liberation. They built monuments to the enslavement. On every world where a labor complex had stood, where human hands had worked without choice for Veltari profit, they built a monument. Simple, precise. Just walls, covered in names. Every name they had. The ones they knew and the ones they had reconstructed from records and the ones listed only by the designation numbers the Veltari had assigned them. Species across the galaxy found these monuments deeply uncomfortable. Several ambassadors suggested delicately that humanity might consider focusing on the victory rather than the wound. Humanity declined, delicately, because the monuments were not for the dead, they were for the living, so that the living would never in any generation, in any comfort, in any prosperity, forget what had been done and what it had cost and what it had taken to answer it, so that no human child would ever grow up thinking that the galaxy was safe by default, so that the species that had outlasted 1,000 years of chains would never make the mistake of the Sarathi or the Drenkai, or the 7 other species who had been conquered because they had forgotten how to survive. 50 years after liberation, a young Veltari scholar, one of the new generation born after the Dominion's dissolution, published a paper that became required reading across the galaxy. It was a historical analysis of the occupation and its aftermath. Its final paragraph read, "We have spent the decades since liberation attempting to understand how we failed to see what was happening beneath our surveillance systems, within our own facilities, in the spaces we believed we controlled completely. The answer, I believe, is simple and devastating. We were looking for the things we feared. We feared rebellion. We feared weapons. We feared the dramatic, visible, sudden reversal. We surveilled for those things obsessively. What we did not surveil for, what it perhaps never occurred to us to surveil for, was patience. We had no category for a species that could sustain coordinated, purposeful generational action for 10 centuries without a single detectable breach. We had no framework for a civilization that could hold a plan for 500 years and not have a single member, not one, in billions, break silence out of desperation or fear, or the simple human need to be heard. We did not understand what we were dealing with. We thought we had tamed something. In truth, we had given it 1,000 years to sharpen itself against us. And when it was sharp enough, it cut. The paper was titled, "On the Nature of Things We Chose Not to Understand." It was distributed by the Watch to every member species of the new Galactic Assembly, with a simple note attached in the margin in humanity's hand. Read it twice. And the galaxy read it. And the galaxy, for the first time in 40,000 years of recorded interstellar civilization, felt something it had never quite felt before. Not fear of humanity's weapons, not fear of humanity's fleet, not even fear of humanity's patience or their planning or the cold, meticulous precision with which they had engineered the collapse of the most powerful empire the galaxy had ever known. Something quieter, something that settled into the galactic consciousness slowly, over years, like a tide coming in. Respect. Not the respect you give to something powerful, the deeper kind. The kind you give to something that earned it the hardest possible way. The kind that doesn't go away. On Dragath 4, where the first labor complex had stood, where Sarah Voss had told 30 children to learn everything and forget nothing, a new structure stood now, not a monument, a school. It had one rule, painted above the entrance in 37 languages. We are building something they cannot see. The children of Dragath 4 went to school there every morning. They learned engineering and physics and history, and the 17 ways that the galaxy had failed them, and the one way that they had refused to fail themselves. And sometimes, in the evenings, when the work of learning was done and the students sat in the grass outside and looked up at the stars, they were not looking at them the way their ancestors had looked up from the floor of a labor complex, with grief and distance and the ache of something lost. They were looking at them the way you look at something that belongs to you, the way you look at something you earned. The galaxy had given humanity 1,000 years of chains. Humanity had returned 10,000 years of consequence. And the ledger, by any accounting, in any currency, across any standard the galaxy had ever devised, was only just beginning to balance. The Galactic Intelligence Directorate had files on every human warship in service. It was their job. The GID maintained the most comprehensive military database in the known galaxy, updated continuously, cross-referenced obsessively, verified through 17 independent intelligence networks spanning 40 star systems. If humanity launched a new vessel, the GID knew about it within 72 hours. Designation, class, armament, crew complement, engine specifications, everything. They were very good at their job, which was why the file on hull designation TSS-001 made absolutely no sense. Subdirector Ven Aras had been staring at it for 3 hours. She was the GID's leading expert on human military capability, a distinction that had taken 12 years to earn, and which she now occasionally wished she could give back. Humans were confusing in ways that other species simply weren't. They were inconsistent, emotional. They made decisions that defied tactical logic, and then somehow those decisions worked, which was the most irritating part. But this file was something else entirely. TSS-001, the Endurance, commissioned 187 years ago, the oldest active hull in the Terran Space Navy by a margin of 60 years. Its original class, the Valor-class heavy cruiser, had been retired from service 140 years ago. Every other Valor-class ship had been decommissioned, scrapped, or converted to museum status. The Endurance alone remained in active service. Why? Vainara scrolled through the technical specifications and felt her analytical mind snagging on every line. The primary weapons array had been replaced 6 times, each replacement using different technology, resulting in what their engineers described as a Frankenstein configuration. Systems from 6 different eras, jury-rigged together in ways that should not technically function. The engine core had been rebuilt 3 times. The hull plating was a patchwork of materials spanning a century of metallurgical advancement, none of it matching. By any reasonable measure, the Endurance should not be able to fly. It flew. More than that, and this was the part that had kept Vainaris in her office for 3 hours. Humanity's own classification system rated the Endurance at threat level Omega, the highest classification in the Terran Navy's threat assessment framework, reserved according to every publicly available source for assets capable of single-handedly altering the outcome of a strategic engagement. The Endurance was 187 years old, visually held together with what humans called spare parts, and somehow rated alongside humanity's most advanced dreadnoughts. She had 17 intelligence sources inside the Terran Navy. Not one of them could tell her why. 3 months later, the Keth sovereignty declared war on the Terran Republic. It wasn't a surprise. The Keth had been building toward it for 4 years, manufacturing grievances, withdrawing from trade agreements, positioning their fleet along the border. Everyone in the Galactic Council had seen it coming. Most had quietly decided it wasn't their problem. The Keth were the second largest military power in the known galaxy. 70,000 warships, give or take. Aggressive, hierarchical, and currently led by High Commander Dran Veth, who had modernized their fleet over 20 years into something genuinely terrifying. Humanity had 19,000 warships and a reputation for doing more with less than anyone considered possible. The opening engagement happened at Kepler's Junction, a strategically vital system with 3 jump points connecting human space to the outer colonies. The Keth sent 400 warships to take it. Fast, overwhelming force seized the junction before humanity could respond. Standard Keth doctrine. It had worked 11 times before. Humanity sent the Endurance. When Dronveth received the intelligence report, he read it twice. Then he called Vane Aris. The GID maintained advisory relationships with several sovereign military commands, and asked her directly. 1 ship, he said. They sent 1 ship to Kepler's Junction. Yes, she said. Against 400? Yes. This ship. He held up his tablet, showing the file on the Endurance. This particular ship. Yes. A pause. Is this a mistake in your intelligence? Van Aris had been asking herself that question for 3 months. No, she said. The deployment order is confirmed. They sent the Endurance to Kepler's Junction. Why? She looked at him steadily. That, she said, is exactly the question. The Endurance arrived at Kepler's Junction 14 hours before the Keth fleet. It didn't hide. It didn't take up a defensive position behind one of the system's planets. It didn't attempt to fortify any of the 3 jump points. It flew to the center of the system, stopped, and waited. Captain Mara Chen stood on the bridge of humanity's oldest warship and looked at the tactical display showing the incoming Keth fleet. 400 ships, 12 hours out, moving with the unhurried confidence of a force that considered the outcome already decided. She was 47 years old. She had commanded the Endurance for 9 years. Before her, it had been Captain Davis for 11 years. Before him, Captain Okafor for 8. The Endurance had a tradition of long commands. Captains didn't leave this ship until they chose to, or until the ship was done with them. The ship wasn't done with any of them. Her executive officer, Commander Torres, appeared at her shoulder. He was 38, sharp-eyed, and had been with the ship for 6 years. He had the particular calm of a man who had made peace with improbable situations. Keth fleet just confirmed our position, he said. They know we're here. Good, Chen said. They're not changing formation. Of course not. She almost smiled. 400 ships against 1 old cruiser, why would they change formation? Admiral's orders were to hold the junction. We're holding the junction. Torres looked at the tactical display for a moment. Captain, permission to ask an impertinent question. You're going to ask it anyway. The crew is asking why we're here alone, what the plan is. He paused. I've been telling them to trust the ship, but they'd like slightly more than that. Mara Chen was quiet for a moment. She looked at the bridge around her, worn consoles, mismatched paneling, a weapons array that looked like an engineering student's fever dream. She looked at the tactical display. She looked at her hands. Tell them, she said slowly, that the Endurance has never lost a battle. Torres waited. And tell them that there's a reason for that. She looked up. And that they're about to find out what it is. The Keth fleet dropped out of jump space at 0914 station time, 400 warships. Beautiful, in a terrible way, sleek dark hulls, Keth engineering at its finest, weapons arrays that could crack a moon. They arranged themselves in assault formation with the practiced ease of a military that had done this many times and expected to do it many more. High Commander Dronveth stood on his flagship bridge and looked at the sensor return from Kepler's Junction. 1 ship, 1 old, scarred, patchwork ship sitting in the center of the system like it was waiting for a bus. Hail them, he said. The communication channel opened. The face that appeared on his screen was a human woman, middle-aged, unremarkable in appearance, with the kind of composed expression that Dronveth had learned, over years of dealing with humans, to be deeply suspicious of. Captain Chen, he said, I am High Commander Dronveth of the Keth Sovereignty. You are 1 ship. Yes, she said. You are 1 very old ship. The oldest in the Terran Navy, she agreed pleasantly. You are in possession of a star system I intend to take. You're welcome to try. Dranveth studied her face for signs of fear, desperation, or concealed intention. He found something he couldn't categorize. She looked like a person who had already seen how this ended and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. It bothered him more than he wanted to admit. I have 400 warships, he said. I can see that. You have one. I have the Endurance, she said, with a very specific emphasis on the name that he didn't understand. That's different from having one ship. He closed the channel. Destroy it, he said. The first Keth strike group was 40 ships, a standard vanguard, more than enough to eliminate a single cruiser before the main fleet even had to engage. They moved in at combat speed, weapons charged, targeting solutions locked. The Endurance didn't move. It sat there while 40 Keth warships bore down on it and did nothing that their sensors could detect. On the bridge, Torres watched the incoming ships with an expression of rigid calm. The crew was at battle stations. Every person on this ship had been through the briefings. They knew what the Endurance was. They knew what it could do. Knowing it in briefings was different from living it. But they were here, and they had chosen to be here, and that had to count for something. 30 seconds, the weapons officer called out. Hold, Chen said. 20 seconds. Hold. Captain, their weapons hot. I know what they are, Lieutenant. Her voice was completely level. Hold. The Keth Vanguard reached engagement range. Chen said one word. Now. What happened next would take the GID's analysts 6 weeks to fully reconstruct, and even then their report contained 17 sections marked Mechanism Unknown. The Endurance fired. Not from its visible weapons arrays, though those fired too, taking out 3 Keth ships in the opening salvo with gunnery accuracy that defied what a 187-year-old weapon system should be capable of. It fired from somewhere else, somewhere that Keth sensors hadn't detected, hadn't categorized, hadn't known to look for. Because the Endurance wasn't just a ship, it was a library. 187 years ago, the original Endurance had been a standard Valor-class heavy cruiser. Fast, capable, well-armed for its era. Nothing exceptional. What made it exceptional was what had happened over the following 187 years. Every time the Terran Navy developed a new weapons technology, they tested it on the Endurance first. Not because the ship was special, because it was old and well understood, and already modified so many times that adding one more system wasn't going to hurt anything. The Endurance was the Navy's testbed, its laboratory. The ship where promising but unproven technology went to find out if it worked before it was trusted to a new hull. Some of those technologies were adopted fleet-wide. Some were rejected as too unstable, too unpredictable, too dangerous for a standard crew to operate. Those stayed on the Endurance, because the Endurance had something no other ship had. 187 years of crew lineage. Captains who had served under previous captains. Engineers who had apprenticed under engineers, who had apprenticed under engineers stretching back to the original commissioning. Institutional memory so deep it had become something else, something closer to instinct. The crew of the Endurance could operate systems that other crews couldn't, because they had been taught by people who had been taught by people who had been taught from the beginning. The ship hadn't been upgraded. It had been accumulated. The weapons that the Keth didn't know about were the dangerous ones. The resonance array, developed 60 years ago, rejected for fleet use because its targeting algorithm required a level of real-time manual calibration that standard crews couldn't maintain under combat stress. The Endurance's weapons crews had been training on it for 60 years. They could maintain it. The gravitational shear cannon, a single massive weapon that used controlled gravitational distortion to tear apart ship hulls without explosive force. Rejected for fleet use because the power draw required temporarily shutting down shields. The Endurance's engineers had spent 40 years developing a workaround. It wasn't elegant. It worked. The phase displacement system, a defensive technology that briefly shifted the ship partially out of normal space, causing incoming fire to pass through empty geometry. Rejected for fleet use because the timing window was 0.3 seconds and required the pilot to make the judgment call manually. The Endurance had a pilot who had spent 20 years doing nothing else. One by one, quietly over 187 years, the Terran Navy had stored its most dangerous ideas inside a ship that looked like it was falling apart. Because a ship that looks like it's falling apart doesn't get analyzed the same way. It gets underestimated. 40 Keth ships came in. 11 came out. The remaining 29 were either destroyed or drifting, disabled with surgical precision. Not random damage, targeted, specific, deliberate. Power cores disrupted, drive systems removed, weapons arrays neutralized. The Keth fleet was looking at 29 hulls that were completely intact structurally and completely non-functional militarily. It had taken 4 minutes. On Dranveth's bridge, nobody spoke. The tactical officer was running the numbers over and over, trying to understand what weapon signatures had caused what damage. The analysis kept failing. The weapons the Endurance had used didn't match any classified system in their database. They matched some theoretical systems, weapons humanity had apparently researched and then, as far as Keth intelligence knew, abandoned. They didn't abandon them, Dranveth said slowly, to no one in particular. His second-in-command looked at him. Commander? They didn't abandon the research, they put it on that ship. He stared at the tactical display. They've been putting it on that ship for... He checked the file on his tablet. For 187 years. A pause. Send in the second wave, he said. Full assault formation. Everything. He needed to know how much was on that ship. The second wave was 360 ships. It was not subtle. It was not tactical. It was the military equivalent of a statement. High Commander Dranveth committing his full remaining force to the destruction of one vessel because, at this point, that was the only rational response. One ship had destroyed 29 of his vanguard in 4 minutes. He no longer had the luxury of restraint. Captain Chen watched 360 Keth warships organize themselves for a full assault and felt the bridge grow very quiet around her. Options, she said. Torres had them ready. Full defensive posture, phase displacement running on a rotation cycle. We can survive the first wave of fire, maybe 2. A pause. After that it depends on how fast Keth gunnery learns our displacement timing. They'll learn it in about 4 exchanges, said Lieutenant Yara, the ship's pilot, without looking up from her controls. She was 26 years old and had been born on this ship. Her mother had been a sensor operator, her grandfather an engineer. She had been flying the Endurance since she was 19, and the ship moved under her hands the way a language moves in the mouth of someone who learned it before they could walk. They're smart. We give them enough data and they'll adjust. Then we don't give them enough data, Chen said. Torres looked at her. Captain, what haven't we used yet? A long pause. Show him, Chen said to the chief engineer. Chief Engineer Dax was 61 years old, bald, and had spent 35 years in the Endurance's engineering section. He pulled up a display that showed the ship's system schematic, a nightmare of overlapping, interlocking, poorly labeled components that would have been impenetrable to anyone who hadn't grown up with it. He pointed to a section near the ship's core. This, he said. Torres stared at it. What is that? We call it the inheritance, Dax said. Officially it doesn't have a designation because officially it doesn't exist. He paused. The ship has been accumulating modifications for 187 years. Some of those modifications interact with each other in ways that nobody planned. We've had engineers studying those interactions for 60 years. He paused again. What we're fairly sure we found, is that the combined effect of all these systems running simultaneously creates something that none of them were designed to create individually. Torres stared at him. Which is what? We don't have a technical term for it. Dax looked almost embarrassed. The crew calls it the chorus. When all the ship's systems run in full synchronization, the Endurance becomes... He searched for words. The targeting becomes predictive, not just calculating, actually anticipating. The defensive systems respond to threats before sensors confirm them. The weapons achieve accuracy that exceeds what their hardware should allow. He paused. We think it's the ship. Torres blinked. You think the ship is? We think 187 years of accumulated modifications have created something emergent. We don't know exactly what it is. We know what it does. Dax looked at the schematic with something between pride and awe. When the chorus runs, the Endurance fights like nothing else in any navy in the galaxy. Because nothing else in any navy in the galaxy has 187 years of accumulated fighting inside it. Silence on the bridge. Have we run it before? Torres asked. 3 times, Chen said quietly. Each time in a situation where there was no other option. She looked at Torres. This is that situation. 360 Keth warships struck the Endurance from every direction simultaneously. It was a coordinated assault of genuine sophistication. Dranveth had reorganized his fleet into a perfect sphere, every ship firing at the same moment, covering every possible evasion vector, designed to overwhelm point defense through sheer simultaneous volume. It should have worked. In the 0.4 seconds between the firing order and the arrival of the first impacts, the Endurance ran the chorus. Every system on the ship activated at once. The lights on the bridge flickered. Dax had warned them about that. The hull vibration changed frequency, dropping into something felt in the chest rather than heard. The weapons consoles across the bridge lit up with targeting solutions that the targeting computers hadn't calculated. Solutions that had appeared, fully formed, as if the ship already knew. Yara's hands moved on her controls before her conscious mind had processed what they needed to do. She would not be able to explain this afterward. She simply knew where the ship needed to be, and she put it there. The Endurance moved. Not evasion in the conventional sense. A dodge, a vector change. Something harder to describe. The ship moved through the incoming fire the way water moves through a gap, finding the geometry that existed between the shots, threading a path that no tactical computer had identified, because no tactical computer had been asked to think that way. 90% of the Keth salvo hit nothing. The 10% that connected impacted shields that had been pre-positioned with foreknowledge of exactly where the hits were coming. The Endurance survived the first salvo without significant damage. Then it fired back. The resonance array, the gravitational shear cannon, weapons that didn't have official names because they'd never been officially adopted, all of them running simultaneously, coordinated by something that wasn't quite a targeting computer anymore. 30 Keth ships in the first return salvo. Gone or disabled. Dranveth watched his tactical display with the particular horror of a military commander who has encountered something genuinely outside his experience. The Endurance was not fighting like a ship. It was fighting like a concept. Every move it made was simultaneously offensive and defensive. Every shot it fired served multiple purposes. It was in the center of 360 enemies, and it was fighting all of them at once. And somehow, it was winning. "What is that ship?" he said. Nobody answered because nobody knew. On the Endurance bridge, Torres stood behind Yara's pilot chair and watched her work, and understood, viscerally, in a way that briefings had not conveyed, what 187 years meant. Not just the technology, the people. Generation after generation of crew passing knowledge forward, each one adding to what the ship could do. None of them ever leaving it completely because their knowledge lived in the next generation and the one after that. The Endurance wasn't just old, it was continuous. It had been continuously crewed, continuously modified, continuously learning for 187 years. And what it had become was the total of everything humanity had figured out about fighting in space across nearly 2 centuries of trying. The Keth fleet had brought their best ships. Humanity had brought their history. At the 50-minute mark, Dranveth had lost 140 ships. He had 220 remaining. He still outnumbered the Endurance, 220 to 1. He was losing, not because his ships were inferior, not because his tactics were wrong. He had adapted 3 times during the engagement, changing formation, changing firing patterns, attempting to find a frequency or rhythm the Endurance couldn't predict. Every time, the Endurance adapted faster. It was always 1 step ahead. Not 2 steps, not 10. 1 step. As if it was learning in real time, incorporating new data, adjusting, as if it had been doing this for so long that learning was simply what it did. Fall back to the jump point, Dranveth said. The retreat order went out at 11:43 station time. 220 Keth warships, pulling back toward the jump point in disciplined formation. Dranveth did not panic, did not rout, moved his forces back with the control of a commander who had accepted an outcome and was managing it. The Endurance did not pursue. It returned to the center of the system. It stopped. It waited. Torres stood beside Captain Chen and looked at the tactical display showing the retreating Keth fleet and tried to find something appropriate to say. "How many did we lose?" Chen asked. 14 crew, Torres said quietly. "Hull breaches in sections 7 and 12. Resonance array is offline. Dax says 2 weeks for repairs. Gravitational shear needs recalibration." A pause. "The chorus is still running at about 40%. Yara says she can bring it down gradually." "Good. Let it wind down gently." She paused. "We break the chorus hard. We'll have power fluctuations for a week." Torres nodded. He had 100 questions. He asked the most important one. "The inheritance, the emergent system, does it always work like that?" Chen was quiet for a moment. "It works differently every time," she said. "That's the point. The chorus isn't a fixed system. It's the ship using everything it has in response to what it's facing." She looked at the bridge around her, the mismatched consoles, the patchwork hull, the weapons arrays that made engineers from other ships wince. The Endurance has faced a lot of things over 187 years. It remembers all of them. Subdirector Vane Aras received the battle report 6 hours after the engagement ended. She read it twice. Then she read the casualty figures. Keth fleet, 174 ships destroyed or permanently disabled. Human casualties, 14 crew. She read the weapons analysis, which took up 40 pages and concluded with the most honest sentence her analysts had ever written in an official document. "We cannot fully account for the mechanisms by which the TSS-001 achieved these results." She sat back in her chair. She thought about the file she had been studying for 3 months. The patchwork hull. The mismatched systems. The threat level Omega classification that had made no sense to her. It made sense now. Humanity had a tradition, she was only now understanding it properly, of not throwing things away. Where other species upgraded by replacing, humans upgraded by adding. Where other species retired old technology, humans kept it, modified it, learned to make it work alongside new technology. They were, at their core, accumulators, hoarders of knowledge, keepers of things that still worked even if they weren't the newest thing. The Endurance was the purest expression of that tradition. It was 187 years of humanity's best thinking about how to fight in space, stored in one hull, maintained by an unbroken chain of human expertise stretching back to the beginning. Every system that the rest of the fleet had decided was too dangerous, too unstable, too hard to operate. The Endurance had taken it and learned it and made it work. The ship wasn't their oldest asset. It was their deepest one. High Commander Dranveth's report to the Keth High Command took him 3 days to write. The difficulty wasn't the facts. The facts were clear and devastating. The difficulty was the explanation. He had to explain to people who had not been there what it felt like to commit your full fleet to the destruction of one ship and watch that ship fight back with something you didn't have a name for. He wrote in the final section of his report, "The Terran vessel, TSS-001, should not be engaged directly under any circumstances. It is not a conventional military asset and cannot be analyzed as one. It represents an accumulation of human military knowledge spanning nearly 2 centuries, operated by crew whose expertise is inherited through direct lineage rather than institutional training. In practical terms, the ship gets better at fighting the longer the fight lasts. Every adaptation we made was anticipated and countered. Every tactic we employed became data that improved its response. I have no recommendation for how to defeat it. I recommend we instead understand what it represents. Not a single powerful weapon, but a philosophy. Humanity does not discard what works. They keep it, improve it, and pass it on. We did not lose to a ship today. We lost to 187 years of practice. 3 weeks after the Battle of Kepler's Junction, the Keth sovereignty requested a ceasefire. The negotiations were long and occasionally difficult. Territory was discussed, trade agreements were revisited. Both sides made concessions. At one point during the third week of talks, the Keth lead negotiator looked at the human delegation across the table and asked the question that had been bothering the entire Keth High Command since the battle. "The threat level Omega classification," he said. "Your own assessment of that ship. When was it assigned that classification?" The human lead negotiator, a calm, unhurried man named Ambassador Cole, smiled slightly. "That classification was assigned 93 years ago," he said, when the Endurance was 94 years old. The Keth negotiator stared at him. "It's been classified Omega for 93 years?" "It gets more dangerous every year," Cole said simply. "The classification just acknowledges reality." A pause. "How old will it be before you retire it?" Cole considered this with the seriousness the question deserved. "Our current projections suggest the Endurance will be combat effective for at least another 60 years. A pause. "By that point, honestly, we're not sure what it will be capable of." He paused again. "Neither is it." The Keth negotiator was quiet for a long moment. "You built a ship that surprises itself," he said. "We built a ship that keeps learning," Cole replied. "That's the same thing." On the Endurance, Captain Chen was in the engineering section with Chief Engineer Dax, looking at the resonance array as his team worked on repairs. "How long?" she asked. 10 days, maybe 12. He patted a conduit that had been spliced and respliced so many times it looked like a metal braid. "She took a beating this time." "She always takes a beating, and she always comes back." Dax said it with the simple confidence of a man who had watched this ship come back from things that should have ended it. He had been in this engineering section for 35 years. His mentor had been here for 28 before him. His mentor's mentor for 22 before that. The knowledge of how to keep this ship flying was in his hands. Had been passed there through those hands, back and back, a chain of human expertise that was as much a part of the ship as its hull plating. Chen looked around the engineering section. Mismatched components, jury-rigged systems. 100 years of modifications layered on top of each other in patterns that would look like chaos to an outside engineer and read like a language to Dax. "Do we know yet what the chorus was doing?" she asked. "The mechanism." Dax shook his head slowly. "Still analyzing. The interactions are complex, doesn't cover it." He paused. "My best current theory is that the ship has developed what you'd call feedback sensitivity. All these systems, running together for so long, they've started responding to each other. Not just functioning in parallel, actually influencing each other. Like," he thought about it, "like how a crew becomes more than the sum of its parts after they've served together long enough." Chen looked at him. "You're saying the ship has crew dynamics. I'm saying the Endurance has been crewed, in a sense, for 187 years. The systems interact the way people interact. They've learned each other." He shrugged, a little helplessly. "I know how that sounds." "It sounds right," Chen said quietly. She put her hand flat against the hull wall. The metal was warm. It was always slightly warm in the engineering section, the heat from systems running close together for decades soaking into the metal itself. She thought about the 14 crew they had lost. She thought about their names, which she had already committed to memory, because that was what captains of the Endurance did. They remembered. She thought about the crew before her, and the crew before them, and the captain who had stood in this engineering section 93 years ago, when someone had first attached the Omega classification to this hull, and understood what it meant. She thought about 60 more years of this, of the ship getting more capable, more aware of itself, more complete. She thought about what it might be by then. "What do we add next?" she asked. Dax grinned, the wide, genuine grin of an engineer who had been waiting to be asked. "Funny you should ask. There's a new propulsion concept out of the Titan labs. Fleet Command rejected it for standard issue. Too unpredictable, they said. Requires too much intuitive calibration. Chen smiled. Tell them we'll take it, she said. The ceasefire between the Terran Republic and the Keth sovereignty was signed 41 days after the Battle of Kepler's Junction. The treaty held. SS-001, the Endurance, returned to active service 11 days after the battle. Its crew complement was restored, its systems were repaired, recalibrated, and in 2 cases upgraded with technologies that no other ship in the Terran Navy carried. The threat level Omega classification was retained. The Endurance continued to serve. It always did.